Hi everyone. So in this third tutorial, we're going to move on to lesson 2 of my GitHub, and we're going to explore in more depth the positioning of objects in 3D space, and also the creation of entities, which is really fundamental to Ursina. So currently our game looks like the following. You can see that it's got sound, and we have now added a 3D texture. But by all means, you may have gone rogue and changed your ground and changed your sky texture. But essentially, this is where we're up to at the moment. So currently, we start in this world. We start at position 0, 0, 0, and it's important to understand what that means. So in terms of a 3D environment, we actually are going to look at positionings in terms of coordinates. And a coordinate of a 3D environment has an X, Y, and Z axis. So if you can imagine a world to position at the center of the world, we are currently at 0 X units, 0 Y units, and 0 Z units. If I wanted to move something, I could change its Z units, in which case it's going to move forward. If I wanted to move something up, I could change its Y units. If I wanted to move something to the right or left, I could change its X units. And because we're starting in the middle of the world, which is 0, 0, 0, going to the left is going to be a negative X. Going backwards will be a negative Z. And going downwards is going to be a negative Y. The other type of movement that we need to be aware of is what's called a vector. And a vector is where, this is vectors, but you can have a vector for a position, or you can actually have a vector for movement. A vector for movement means that we can actually make it so that object can move each frame a certain number of units up or down, a certain number of units to the left or right, or a certain number of units back and forward. Now, this is not a good example because they have rearranged their axes. There seems to be in certain maths they use Z as being up, but for us in Ursina, Z is going to be back and forth. Okay, so Z is our depth, Y is up and down, X is left and right. So how does this work? Well, let's create ourselves our first entity. And by the way, we've created an entity before. We have created the ground, and that was an entity. That entity was a plane. And it simply sits there, and we give it a scale, which means it is now 128 units in terms of width and 128 units in terms of height. But what I want to do is create a very simple entity, which is a cube, and we're going to load that inside loading. We should always load most of our assets inside the loading function. And in Ursina, as soon as you create an entity, it's automatically added to the scene and is renderable. So we're going to create a very simple cube. And the cube is of type entity. And inside the cube, we're going to give it a model. So every entity can have a model, or it doesn't have to have a model at all if you want it to be invisible. But in this case here, we're going to give it a model. And the default models are cube, sphere, plane. I think circle's also a model as well. But we're just going to use a cube. And we're going to give it a position. So I was saying that with our position, we can actually give it a vector of 3 coordinates. So we can give it a 0, an X coordinate, a Y coordinate, and a Z coordinate. And then I can give it a scale. The scale is the size of the cube. And again, I'm going to give it a vector, which is going to be the number of units that goes along the x-axis, the number of units tall it is, and the number of units that it's going to go backwards. and then I'm going to give it a color. Now I could give it a texture if I wanted to, but I'm just going to give it a color. And again, you'll notice, as I said in the last tutorial, that we can actually simply use the parameters and give them values explicitly in the function itself. So when I create this entity object, I'm going to make sure that it's got a color of red. Actually, maybe I'll make it blue, just because we're already using red for our player object. Okay, so you can see that it's going to be 1 by 1 by 1 cube. It's going to be at position 0, 0, 0. All right, let's see how it goes. I'm going to press play. And you'll notice now I have my blue cube. But you're going to wonder, why is it sunken into the ground? And that's it. This is an important concept. The reason why it's sunk into the ground is that every time you create an entity in Ursina, the origin or the center point of that entity, which is where it calculates its position, is in its middle. So the middle of the entity is now positioned at 0, 0, 0, which is not actually what we wanted. So what we're going to do is we're going to move we can either move the position, so I could move it up 0.5, or alternatively I can move its origin, which is essentially its center. So if you can imagine that anytime you create a 3D model, an origin exists for that 3D model at its center. And you can position your model using that origin. But if I wanted to change the origin, I can. The important thing to note is the origin will be applied before the scale is applied. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it an origin, and I'm going to give it 0, 0, 0 initially, but this time I want to make it so that its center point, the center point by which its position is calculated, is actually going to be half the size of the cube. And so now that cube is going to sit on the surface at 0, 0, 0. Rather than just playing, every time I play the screen it actually wastes a bit of time, I'm actually going to show you how I can position a wall in that method. So I'm actually going to get rid of that cube and I'm going to position a wall. So I'm going to create an entity. I've called it wall. It has a model of cube. I'll talk about colliders later on. I've given it an origin. In this case, I'm actually going to give the origin to be actually at its far left bottom corner. So you can imagine that it's actually going to be right here is its actual origin. Well, sorry, it's actually going to be in the middle, but in its far left bottom corner. And I'm going to do that for a reason, as in I want to actually put the wall at the end of our plane, which defines our world. Then I'm going to scale it. So once you've defined the origin, you can always scale. The scale is 8, 8 by 2. So it's going to be 8 units along the x-axis, 8 units along the y-axis, and 2 units deep. I'm going to give it a position, and I'm actually going to position it at negative 64, 0, 64. So it's actually going to be negative 64 units to the left and 64 units back. And if you think about our environment, I said that the plane, which is the ground, is 128 by 128. The middle of it is 0, 0. So if you think about the far left top corner, that's going to be negative 64, 0, 64. Then I give it a texture. I can give any object a texture. And I've given it a stone wall texture. And I've then said, okay, well, how many times do I want that texture to kind of texture the X, Y, and Z units of my wall? So now I've got a wall in the top left-hand corner of my screen. And I'm going to press play now so you can see the environment. because what we're going to have to do is to ensure that the player doesn't actually fall off the world. I'm going to put this wall all the way around the plane, because as you can see in a second, I can actually just jump off my world, and like so. So I'm actually now off my world. Okay, so I'm going to quit there, but you get the idea. It's very important that you understand what a 3D vector is, being an X, Y, and Z coordinate, understand how the position of an entity is calculated, and as soon as you create the entity, that is automatically going to be rendered by the Ursina engine, unless you set enable to equal false or set visibility to equal false. So it's always going to be rendered automatically. I've just created this as a variable, a standard variable, and I haven't actually added it to my game object class. If you want certain variables to be accessible through the actual game controller, all you need to do is put a self in front of it, and then it becomes a variable of my game object, which makes it easier to access later on. But for the moment, I am actually just going to, it's just a wall. I don't actually need to access it later on. I just want to set it up. The other thing is, if I want to make it so that the player can't go through the wall, all I need to do is set a collision box, and we'll talk more about that in later lessons. Okay, thank you very much for listening.